Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Projects with Foster. And today I'm going to show you one of the first tools that we use in the shop, hand saws. We've got a number of different saws that we use. We're going to concentrate mainly on our crosscut saw today because I'm cutting my name sign. I'm cutting the board, so I want to crosscut this, and we'll talk about that. But I also want to introduce you to a couple of the other saws that we use here. Just so you're familiar when we get there. This is a back saw, and this is one that we use a lot. It's got a reinforcement along here. If you've ever used a big hand saw and you had the blade doing that on you, that's a nice thing. This won't do that. A lot of our pieces are pretty small, and this is a great way to make a nice square cut. You can use this with a miter box, a manual miter box, to make 45s and 90s cleanly. But this is a back saw, and we'll talk about that one again. A couple of the other saws, all of the saws that we use, most of the saws we use are push saws. You're cutting on the push stroke. These two are a little different. These are called pull saws. And so these have the teeth facing back towards your hand, and this one has bigger teeth on one side, smaller on the other. So you're cutting on the pull stroke, and some would say you've got a little bit more control with that. These are great because they're flexible. If you're doing trim or something around your house, you can have this down along the floor and be cutting something with it. But you got to be really careful, especially with these. I end up always touching the wrong side because I do that. But be careful with these because they're just like razors. But they're nice for little pieces. When we're cutting dowel and stuff like that, those are a good one to use. But our main goal today is to talk about these two. They look the same. If you were grabbing these off the shelf, you probably wouldn't notice the difference between the two, but one of them's a rip saw and one of them's a crosscut saw. So what do we mean by that? Well, if I'm cutting my board, there's two ways I can cut it. I can cut it against the grain, or I can cut it with the grain. If I'm cutting it with the grain, we call that ripping. That's a rip cut. We might use the table saw for that. That works a little bit better than doing it by hand if you've got a long board to cut, but sometimes you just need to rip a piece down and make it thinner. That's not what we're doing today. I've already ripped this board down to 5.5 inches, and now I just need to cut off my end piece here. So I'm going to use a crosscut, which means that's harder, right? If you think about it, the grain has all this fiber that's running this direction. So when I'm cutting with a rip saw, I'm going with that. Whereas this way, I've got all these fibers, I'm cutting across the grain with that. And that's harder. And I'll explain why the saws are different. So if we take a look at, first of all, our rip saw, right? So rip saw, easier, right? So the blade, or the teeth on the blade of the rip saw, you can see they're big, right? And rip saw has bigger teeth. They have a little bit sharper angle, and the teeth themselves are shaped differently. They're flat on the tip. Think of it like a chisel, right? So you've got a chisel that's got that flat end. And because it's a little easier going with the grain, you're literally chiseling off chunks. Tiny little chunks. We see it as sawdust, but they're bigger chunks. And so the teeth on your rip saw are flat at the end, and the set, so every saw, the teeth are like this. So this is the kerf of them, is that groove that it cuts. If they're further out, then you have a bigger set, and it will cut a bigger kerf, and it would be harder to push through. Well, that's what a rip saw has. The teeth are a little bit more, have a little bit more of a set to them. Otherwise, what happens, and when our saws get old, they kind of lose some of that set. Then that board pinches as you're trying to get the saw through. That's why you get that bend. It's grabbing it, and the board pinches. So that's our rip saw. Again, we don't use a lot here in shop. It's nice to have one, though, in your kit when you're on the job. So more like a chisel, whereas a crosscut saw has a little bit smaller teeth and a little bit with more of an angle, 15 degrees, but they cut more like a knife, right? So if we think about our board here, and I'm trying to cut across this grain. I don't want to try to chisel at that because that's too hard. You're taking big chunks. This is more like a knife, like I'm sawing through a steak or something, you know? And so it actually has 2 rows of knives, if you think about it, and that's sort of the set, again, of those is like 2 rows of knives. And what it's doing is taking out the material on both sides. So it really kind of starts by taking out the 2 sides, and then it sort of takes out the center of it. Smaller teeth, less set, and it is able to saw down through the fibers to clean it off. So here's our setup. I've got my board and I'm ready to cut this. So I bring this down to the bench here. Bring this down a little bit. And I'm ready to cut this. I'm going to cut on this side of my line. I've got a nice dark line I put on there with a straight edge so that I know where I'm cutting. I got about 1 inch on either side of my name. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to clamp this down. I don't want this moving around on me. I got kind of a funky spot here because I'm right in the way of this vise here. The vise is in my way, but I still got room. So again, remember, adjust your clamps so that when they come down, the surface is flat. And the only way to do that is just like James Brown, you gotta get down. You gotta look underneath there. Otherwise, if it's just holding on the tip of this, it's gonna move and you don't have a good tight grab. There we go. So now I'm clamped down. Now I need my, my glasses and my saw. So I like to think if you ever play pool, you know what that motion is like when you're striking the cue ball, right? It's a nice, smooth, straight motion. I like to think I'm like a train here, you know. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with my crosscut saw, and I'm gonna place it just on this side of my line. I can square this up later. All I'm trying to do is cut this off. I'm not trying to make a perfect cut, right? So I've got that, and the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna get my body in position, right? It's kind of athletic position. This is like when you're playing softball or something. You gotta get yourself in athletic position, because it really is. This is physical. So I've got my blade set. I've got a little bit of an angle to it. First thing I'm going to do is just pull back once. So when I do that, I've started my cut. I've made a little curve there where I want it to be. That pull motion, I've got control. So now I want to try to use as much of the length of the saw as comfortable and just get into the rhythm. Again, James Brown comes back to us and we just got to get a little rhythm going. And you can feel I'm watching my line, not trying too hard, not pushing too hard, and there we go. One thing you want to be careful of when you get towards the end of that, you don't want to rip that out. Sometimes when that last corner falls off, you rip a little piece out. You don't want that. So there you go. There's our saws. We've got the crosscut. We got the rip saw, we got some pull saws and some back saws, but now I'm ready for the next step in my project. Thank you. We'll see you again.